Cool. So, good morning. I know a couple of you. For those who I do not, my name is Jeff Strauss. I am from St. Louis, Missouri, which is like right in the center of the United States. I do a lot of things. I am a technologist by trade and profession. I'm a developer and a software architect and consultant and a bunch of other things. I wear many, many hats, conference organizer, all these other things. But in addition, I am, in fact, a lawyer. And I'm sorry. But I don't practice. And I haven't practiced, I did, but I haven't practiced law full-time in about 14 or so years. I am still licensed. I keep my license active in Missouri. But this is important. I'm not your lawyer. Okay. I have to say that, so I've said it. Not your lawyer. I say it for a few reasons. One, because I don't want to be disbarred. Two, because lawyers are actually important. Like, it's really good to, I don't really even like lawyers. It's okay to hate lawyers. But you shouldn't hate your lawyer. I'm not suggesting you all hate me. But if you have a good relationship with a good attorney, they know you. They know what matters to you. They know the ins and outs of your situation. They can actually give you proper advice about the things that are tailored to your needs. I am not that, right? So I just say that to be clear. Like, people will have questions, and I'm happy to have questions, happy to talk about things, but realize we're talking about some legal topics around contracts and licenses and what they mean, but I can't possibly know enough about your situation to represent you. So don't go back and think that you're getting legal advice, because you're not. Okay. Why does this topic matter? Like, why do we care about this? There's lots of great technology sessions going on. It's a conference about developers and development topics, but you've chosen to come here to listen to a lawyer drone on about licenses and contracts. Why do we care, right? I think it matters because open source is everywhere, right? There was a time when it wasn't, right? For those of us who are old enough to remember that, there was a time when shops would build software and everything was built in-house and everything was proprietary. Open source and a lot of large enterprise-type organizations were afraid of open source because of what that might mean or what they thought it might mean and what their lawyers thought it might mean. But the truth is, we can't really build software today without it, right? .NET Core is open source. The vast majority of things in the JavaScript world are open source. A lot of database technologies. So we can't get by without it, and yet we do this thing every day where we build software using open source libraries and components, even though we don't necessarily even know what that means or what the implications are for us. I care a great deal about that. That's why I talk about this. We're going to talk in the second half of the talk about certain key licenses, major licenses that you see frequently. But I like to sort of level set because I think you don't know what you don't know. And I think a lot of people have an idea about what open source means. But I want to make sure we're all on the same page. So first off, what is this thing? What is open source software? I'm going to throw it out there. So in law school, you have this thing where you kind of pace back and forth, and the professor looks around, and no one's willing to raise their hand. And so then we turn and we say, Mr. Doler, what is open source software? Because no one raises their hand. And so I'm going to ask you. But anyone else who has ideas? I want to hear them.
It is software that is free for legally free for you to use. Free money-wise.
Software that is legally free for you to use money-wise. That's interesting. All the way up to like that last word. It's interesting. Anyone else? Thoughts? Okay. Oh, yeah.
You get the source.
You get the source. You get the source, not just the binaries. Great. Okay. So open source software, I mean, that's true. Art's thing was mostly true.
Also community.
There's a community component. So open source software really is software that you receive under an open source license, specifically. And an open source license is a license that is guaranteed to have certain elements of it that help you to understand and have expectations about what your rights or obligations are with respect to the software. It is in many respects a standard. Not a standard the way we think about like, the ECMAScript spec or a .NET spec, but it's a standard around a family of licenses that mean that you can expect a certain thing. And among those things are these kind of 5 key principles, right? The idea of free redistribution, right? Access to the source code, the ability to have derivative works, non-interference, and non-discrimination. I want to talk through those so you understand what those things mean. So first off, free redistribution. Cool, right, we use the word free. Free. In fact, before there was open source, there was freeware, right? Remember freeware? Or a lot of people, it's the FOSS community, right? Free and open source software. It's free. Right, true. We mean free as in free speech, not free as in free beer. Okay? It may be free as in free beer. It may be. Not necessarily. We mean free as in freedom of information. So when we talk about free software, the reason for that, if you go back even before the days of open source software, and you look at people like Richard Stallman, and people who are big in the free software movement, the idea is that if you have software that is executing in your environment that you control, you should have the right to understand what it is that you have executing in that environment. You should have the right to see it and understand what's happening, the right to work with it, manipulate it, and understand what it is that is running in your computer systems. That only happens if you have the freedom and access to this information. That's why it's free software. And so you have the right to receive that software, and you have the right to freely redistribute it as you see fit. I receive it from you, and I can give it to you, and to you, and to you, and to the world. Free redistribution. The other thing that I think most people think of, which is the other answer, right, that I always get, is source code inclusion. True, right? You have to receive, so if I make a distribution of open source software, I either have to distribute with that distribution or easily accessible with that distribution. I have to be able to obtain the source code. Now, I think most of us probably understand that like this is not source code. Right? The compiled binaries, the ones and zeros, the machine language instructions, whatever else, are not source. Okay? Neither is this. That's not source code. Okay? It's something, right? We can probably find ways to decompile that or de-obfuscate or whatever that and see source code. Doesn't matter, that's not good enough. And to take it a step further, let's say you build stuff, who does JavaScript stuff, lives in JavaScript land? Okay, because like everybody does today, right? Like, okay, who does TypeScript? A few people. So if you build an application with TypeScript, and then you compile it into JavaScript, and you have a distribution, and you're distributing and serving up that JavaScript, that's great. That's not the source. The source is what the developers wrote to make the application execute and function the way they intend. It is not enough to write great TypeScript, have it compile into whatever like impossible to read JavaScript that comes out of that thing, and give that out. Source code. All right, derivative works, or derived works. This is interesting. So this is kind of a couple of different rights, one of which seems familiar and is sort of related to free redistribution. You have the right to modify the open source software. You have the right to modify it. So not only I give it to you, you have the right to open and play with it and poke at it and do whatever you want and either make, fix things, add new features, combine it with other software to have some sort of new product that uses the open source you've received. And you have the right to redistribute that thing that you have made. So it's not just that I can have open source software that I'm allowed to freely redistribute to give to somebody else. I can morph it into something else, and that other thing I can freely hand out. Now, distribution is important because open source licenses are not just about giving rights. Right? A license, and that's why this is sort of a legal talk, a license is a contract. Just like we were talking before about EULAs, and you check the box and you pretend like you read it and you say, okay. A license is a contract. It giveth and it taketh away. So there are certain restrictions that you have to abide by when you receive open source software, just like any other software that you receive under a given license. And so usually those requirements of you as the consumer and redistributor of open source software come into effect upon distribution to others. Which means we have to think about what distribution even means, right? So if I have software and I build something using open source software, and I have a company of 50 people, and I'm building tooling and things or dashboards, whatever else that we're all going to use, and it gets installed on every computer in the office, and everyone on the team, everyone gets this software. Have I distributed software? What do you think? So he says yes. The official lawyer answer for almost every question is maybe, or it depends, or generally no. Generally no, if it's inside the four walls of the company, the figurative four walls of the company. The reason for that is, remember, why does freedom matter? Right, it's freedom of information and software that executes in your environment on hardware or things that you own. Okay, well, if I have 50 employees and the company owns all those workstations, those laptops and those things, and the software is only going onto those machines, I'm not distributing to anyone, I'm distributing to myself. The fact that you are the one using the machine is irrelevant. It's about, right, it's executing on your hardware, but that's really my hardware. So I haven't distributed. On the other hand, if I have contractors, customers, just any third parties where I don't control it, then I have distributed software. I have to worry about this. This comes into play also when we think about SaaS products, which is everywhere now, right? So imagine I build a service and it's living up in the cloud somewhere. Does anyone else actually still say like up in the cloud? I still like point at the sky. Like it's up in the cloud. I don't know why I do that. So we have software up in the cloud. So I haven't really distributed anything. If you're accessing a service that is executing in an environment that I control, it doesn't matter, by the way, that it's an Azure data center, if it's my Azure data center, right? If it's my VMs or my whatever that I control the hosting for, if I'm just serving up a service and someone else is accessing my service that is executing in my environment, I haven't distributed software, usually. There's one exception, which we'll talk about a little later. But then, what am I serving down? Maybe my APIs are running in the cloud, but I'm serving HTML and CSS and JavaScript and images, whatever, like I'm serving content down to somebody. Well, the stuff I'm serving actually down that is then executing that JavaScript, that's being distributed, even if, say, the C# stuff that's running up in the, and it doesn't matter that it's JavaScript, by the way, like WebAssembly, C#, Blazor stuff. I'm serving things down to a client, now I've distributed software. Same thing with mobile devices, right? This sandbox environment. So you got to think about where is the software being used and who is using it to determine whether you have distributed. Make sense? Cool. All right. Non-interference is kind of an interesting one. So non-interference is really about neutrality. And it's a few different things. So first off, it's technology neutrality. So if I build an open source library, and I built it with the intent that it's going to run, say, on Linux, or I built it with the intent that it's some library that is meant to be plugged in and used in a library for a Java application. And someone else is able to take that thing and port it. They fork the repo and they port it into something that will work in .NET, or that will work in Windows or on a Mac or wherever else. The open source license cannot prevent you from being able to do that. I can't say, this is open source, but it is intended to only be used with Java and in Linux. Right? That's interfering with someone else's use of their technology stack, what they see fit. By the same token, if I have some sort of a distribution, so let's say that I have a couple different open things and I send a distribution out, and it also goes along with some closed source, some proprietary software, and that's my distribution, I can't require you, as the consumer of my open source software, to say that you have to always redistribute that alongside some other specific piece of software. You can redistribute just that as you see fit, and I cannot require you to have it always packaged with this. I cannot require you to only distribute it on a given medium or to not distribute it with a given medium. I can't interfere with anything else about how you are choosing to use the technology and in what environment you choose to do so. Okay? And lastly, non-discrimination. So discrimination can mean a lot of things, right? And yes, there are requirements around how you can't have discriminatory purposes in terms of things like race and gender and those sorts of things. But also, we mean discrimination of purpose. Purpose. So Suppose that I'm a bank, and I write financial software, and I build some sort of calculation engine, and I decide this thing's pretty cool, I'd like to open source this financial component, this software. So I'm going to open source this thing, because I think this way of doing calculations is useful for the developer community as a whole. The license, if it's open source, the license cannot say, you're free to use it in any way you want, except you cannot use it in a financial or banking piece of banking software, because then you're competing with me. So you can use this for whatever else, but you cannot use it for banking because I'm using it for banking. That is not allowed. That's discrimination of purpose. And in fact, Crockford's not in here, is he? So Douglas Crockford, I think, is here this week. He, somewhat famously, has had situations around this before, because he had a license that he wanted to modify. I think it was a modification of the MIT license at one point, where he wanted to say, but you have to use it for good, not for evil. And eventually it was decided, okay, your license can say that, but it's not an open source license, because even for evil, you cannot stop someone from using it, right? So like, you know, Voldemort gets tired of relying on and having to worry about human error with his Death Eaters and says, I'm just going to build an automated thing, and I'm going to use MySQL for that. Okay, nothing in the license will tell him he can't. Okay, now, that doesn't mean he's not going to Azkaban. Okay, so understand that when we say you can't prevent the user from using a thing in a certain way, this is a contract. We're talking about contract law. We're not talking about criminal law. So just because I say, well, you can do whatever you want with open source software, that doesn't mean you can actually, you know, use it to build things that will commit genocide. It just means that the license won't stop you from doing that, because we're talking about intellectual property law and nothing else. Intellectual property law generally globally refers to a few different things. Most frequently and notably, copyrights, patents, and trademarks. And I have a whole different talk about just this slide. There's more slides than that, but about the stuff on this slide. But in a very quick nutshell, copyright is about protecting works and authorship. Right? Patents are about protecting ideas, inventions, and trademarks are about identity or brand. So when we talk about open source licenses, first off, we're talking about intellectual property. Secondly, we're talking mostly about copyright. You're getting a right. I'm distributing open source software to you, and I'm giving you a right, a license, to my copyrighted work of authorship. Some licenses, not all, we'll talk about that in a few minutes, give you license over patents or patentable works, but not all, which is a potential problem. They have nothing to do with trademark. So just because I give you open source software that no one cares about my identity and my brand, but if I were Microsoft, just because I'm giving you access to ASP.NET Core does not mean that you have a license to use my trademarks, which means my logos, my name, like your derivative work is not Microsoft software, right? So it's only those first two, and sometimes, often only the first. One other thing about this, so sale. Can you sell open source software? Can you sell it? I see a maybe. I see a yes, you can. Right? Now Art knows that right? Because, so yeah, oh yeah, I mean, like, you totally can. And you can make a lot of money doing it. You can make a lot of money in open source. Free as in free speech, not free as in free beer. It can be free as in free beer. It is often free as in free beer. It doesn't have to be. Now, here's the thing about that. The reason is because these two words do not mean the same thing. You can have commercial software, meaning software that is for making money, right? Commercialized software that is still open source software. You can have proprietary software that you give away for free. They don't mean the same thing. The trouble is free redistribution, right? First principle of open source software. So I can sell you something. You can buy it from me. You can turn around tomorrow, same day, in 5 minutes, and you can sell it to someone else for $1 less. You can give it away for free. If I gave it to you as open source, sold it to you as open source, I can't stop you. Otherwise, it's not open source software. How does that work? Like, how do we manage that? How can anyone sell open source software when the consumer can turn around and buy it or sell it the next day? Thoughts?
You sell the support.
Sell the support. Yeah, sell the support's great. So for example, that's actually like the first example, right? Take something like Red Hat. Red Hat does a handful of things. So first of all, you have support. I don't work for any of these companies, by the way. So there will be logos up here. They are not me, just to be clear. But like, right, so they sell support, warranties, right? If you get the Red Hat Linux kernel, you know it's the Red Hat Linux kernel. If you get Jeff's Linux kernel, oh, okay, right? So you know what you're getting. You sell services around that. You sell, now Red Hat actually has some enterprise components around their enterprise Linux that are not free that then plug into their kernel, right? So you can do that. Yeah, Art.
You can sell it as trading on your reputation so that you know you're getting something secure.
You can sell it as trading on your reputation so you can get something secure. Right. In addition to that, you can be the Bobs, right? People remember Office Space? It's actually like an older movie than I think it is, right? But it's not even a sentence. So you can be like the Bobs and sell consulting services around your open source. So it's not just support. It can be, here's this open source. I'm selling you this because then you're going to get our developers, our engineers who will come in and help you integrate it into your environment, into your systems, help you plug it into your other enterprise tooling. Right? The bottom line, though, and what I always tell people, is that if you think you're selling open source software, you're not. You're wrong. Okay? You have to plus the thing. And then when you do, what you're selling is the plus plus. You are giving away open source software, and what you're selling is your reputation, the warranties, the support, the consulting, the plugins, anything else, the things that make your open source more valuable than like, Susie down the road who can give it away for free. That's what you're selling. Any questions about anything so far? Awesome. So we've level set what open source software is. I'm going to have a quick sip of water, and we're going to talk about some licenses. Yay. Now, licenses, open source licenses, we've already said way back at the beginning of the talk, are the family of licenses that follow this open source definition. And the open source definition is the thing that says you've got to have like the free redistribution, the source code inclusion, the non-discrimination, all of that. That open source definition, anybody heard of OSI before? A couple people, okay. So the open source initiative is like this organization, they're like the standards organization, if you will. They're the keepers of the open source definition, which also means that when someone wants to produce, say, a new license, like an MIT license that has a variant that says shall only be used for good and not evil, OSI are people who will ultimately, in theory, have the final say and say, that's fine. And again, it's not that you can't use a license that says that thing, but OSI is who will say, but it's not open source. You can't call it open source because open source means a thing, and the reason it matters that it means that thing is that anyone who gets anything under an open source license at least knows they're going to have these certain rights and responsibilities. Open source licenses follow sort of a spectrum, from very permissive to what's called a copyleft. And what this generally has to do with is how restrictive your rights may be to do what you see fit with the open source. And I know I've just spent the first half of the talk talking about, well, you can do whatever, and you can give it away and do these things, and that's all true. But actually, as we work through this spectrum, things that move away from the permissive side of the spectrum are more rigid because a copyleft license requires that the thing will always be open. That the thing that is open today must and will always be open forever. We're going to talk more about that at the end of sort of this run through the licenses. What we're going to talk about, though, are 4 main families of licenses, and collectively they make up somewhere between 80 and 90% of all repos on GitHub. There's way more than 4 open source licenses, but if you look at MIT, BSD, Apache, and GPL, and their various flavors, that makes up most of what you're going to come across. We're going to talk about them in that order as we shift from most permissive to most copyleft. Okay? Who's familiar with the MIT license? Who has heard of the MIT license? who has used software with the MIT license? Who believes the MIT license is the ultimate holy grail and we want MIT license on everything that we use? It's OK to raise your hand. All right. Sort of. So, the MIT license is very popular. It is extraordinarily permissive. The reason it is popular with developers is because it looks like this. Now, don't read this. You'll notice I don't put like 2 words on the slide. It's a lot of words. Don't read that. But the point is, as much as that is for a slide, trust me, I'm a lawyer, this is like a nursery rhyme, as legal documents go. There's like nothing here. It's very, very simple and straightforward. Really, all that's happening is just 3 things. The first paragraph is just a non-exclusive list of some of the many things that you can do with the software you receive. You can copy it, publish it, sub-license it, sell it, whatever. Okay? The second little paragraph is just about attribution, saying you can do all these things, but please don't steal it. Right? Don't remove the copyright notices from someone else's open source. Like, don't do that, ever, ever. Like, that's plagiarism and theft. Open source software does not mean you can steal. Someone else wrote it, they have a copyright notice on it, keep it there. Give attribution to the software as you received it, right? And share the license back out. And then this big thing where they're shouting at you in all caps, which is the worst thing that lawyers do, because I think it's impossible to read. I actually think it's like a game. I believe that we do this because it's actually harder to read something in all caps because we're not used to it. When it's like, no, we're calling it to your attention. Okay, there's 2 very important words. As is. That big giant shouting paragraph is a disclaimer of warranty. You can use it. You can do whatever you want with it. I'm not promising you that it does what you think that it does. I'm not promising you that it does what I think that it does. I'm saying here's some software. Because guess what? If it's broken, you get the source code anyway. You can fix it. Okay? As is. But that's it. Like, that's the MIT license. People like it because there's almost no restriction on what you can do. It's very permissive. It's like my second favorite license. For business and enterprise purposes anyway, I should clarify that. For using open source in the enterprise, it's like my second favorite license. Just remember that. Put a pin in that. So, in addition to the MIT, there's also the BSD. So people hear MIT, and they know it's associated with academia, because many people, at least in our field, I think no matter where you are in the world, you hear MIT, you know it's like MIT. It's okay. BSD is also an academic license that it comes from many, many years ago that came out of Berkeley. It was a license associated with the Berkeley software distribution, so the BSD is, that actually predates the open source definition, as the MIT license does. Now the BSD license is a little tricky because there's more than one version. There's more than one version of the MIT, but they're basically all the same. The BSD license, there's more than one version, and they are not all basically the same. And they have like different names for the same versions, so it can be confusing. Ultimately, when you look at the BSD license, you're going to see, in addition to a couple other paragraphs, you're going to see some numbered clauses. Okay? So just remember, there's the 2 clause, the 3 clause, and the 4 clause. And if there's 2 numbered clauses, you have the 2 clause version. If there's 4 numbered clauses, you have the 4 clause version. Okay? So the 2 clause version is very similar to the MIT. Attribution and a disclaimer of warranty. And that's basically it. Now the 3 clause version, which I believe is the most common, adds what's called a non-endorsement provision. The non-endorsement provision says that in distributing or republishing this software you've received from me, in your marketing or advertising materials, you cannot use the name of the author or authoring organization in such a way as to suggest endorsement by that organization of your software. That's actually a pretty good thing. So if I receive ASP.NET Core under the 3 clause BSD, and it has this provision, that means I can't advertise the software I build with it and act like this thing's endorsed by Microsoft. It's built with ASP.NET Core, and you can trust it because they stand behind me. No, they don't. Right? That's valuable because I may be awesome, and I may write awesome libraries, and you may be terrible and might write terrible software. And I don't want you using my reputation to go out there and say, look at this amazing thing built with it, and now it damages the reputation of the original upstream author of the library. Okay? The for clause, BSD, is very uncommon. But you still might see it. It has an advertising provision, which sounds like it says exactly the opposite of the thing I just said, which is very confusing. The advertising provision says, in those same advertising materials, those ads, the marketing, promotional stuff that you have to give credit. Basically, it's going to say, this software produced using software written by Microsoft, written by Art, written by Jeff Strauss. Not in a way that makes it look like I endorsed it, but giving credit in those advertising things. Now, that actually sounds nice too, right? It's not. It was at first. The reason it's not is because it's cumulative. Okay? And so the trouble is, not only do you have a potentially growing list of contributors or core organizations that wrote the one library you're using, but over time it became apparent that as OpenScale became more and more proliferated through the industry, you have big enterprise packages of software that use maybe 50, 100 different open source libraries and components, and by the time they go to market and they take out a $10,000 full page at an MSDN, it's an entire page full of like an Academy Award thank you speech. You know, like built using software written by all of these other people. Oh, by the way, it does some security thing. It became onerous. It was terrible. So you very rarely see it, because it actually became a stumbling block for use by enterprise developers and enterprise shops. Okay? Now, these two licenses both predate open source. They both came out of academia. There was like a golden age of computing when like everything was sunshine and rainbows, and like it was all for the common good. And the reason these came out of academia was because software was only being written largely at universities, because only universities could afford computers that took up the size of this room. And so that's fine. And then what happened, and this is a bigger problem I think in the United States, okay, than many other places, but it is a problem everywhere, is like we have patent trolling, because patents over software became a thing. Now, setting aside the soapbox of how I may feel about patents and software, it's a thing. And a lot of people use patents for evil in the software world, right? And the MIT license and the BSD license say nothing whatsoever about patents at all. You're getting a license over my copyrighted work of authorship. If I also happen to patent that thing, so sorry. You don't have a license to use my patent royalty-free. Okay. So Apache came along, and they tried to fix that. And the Apache license has pre-existed these problems as well. But Apache actually has like version numbers, because we're software geeks and engineers, so everything has to have version numbers, right? It's not like the 1994 version of Apache. It's like Apache version 1.1. Okay. And 1.1 and earlier are basically gone. You rarely see them, and Apache released a whole new Apache 2.0 license. And the Apache 2.0 license does not look like the MIT license. It is long, and it has a whole definitions section of like, these capitalized terms mean the following things. And it has all sorts of section titles and references, and that's fine. Like, it makes it harder for a typical developer to read, but one of the important pieces is that it gives a little more clarity and certainty, and it specifically gives a patent license. The Apache license says, in addition to all these other things, you also have a license to any patented or patentable works that are part of this software. That makes life a lot easier, especially in an enterprise type space. Because what I don't want to do is be Acme Corp and write software using some open source library, and then after I've gone to market and I'm making millions of dollars with my Acme Soft, for some random person who holds a patent to come back to me and sue me for royalties or tell me that I have to cease and desist using their software because they went and got a patent in some jurisdiction somewhere. Okay? But Apache goes one step further that actually makes it even better. So it says, you have a license over the patent, and then it also has what we affectionately, morbidly refer to as like a poison pill, and is technically called a patent non-assert clause, which says, you have a license over my patent. And in addition, if you ever turn around and attempt to assert patent rights or pursue patent litigation back against the authors and contributors of this software yourself, right? If you say, thank you so much for the license, now I'm going to go claim a patent and come back and troll you, your license expires. It terminates automatically by force of law. Full stop. You come back and you try to sue me for royalties or patent infringement, you no longer have the license to use my patented thing. I don't have to sue you. I mean, I may have to sue you, but I don't have to do that in order to make that have effect. It just happens automatically. So it tries to protect the stream in both directions. Now, I don't know how many people keep track of these sort of things in the news, and it's been a year or two now. Anyone familiar with the React licensing fiasco that happened? Anybody remember that, reading about that at all? Okay, so that's good because it means that there's not be confusion necessarily about this. But a quick aside in the story, because Facebook did some things, shocking, I know, especially going back to the discussion earlier about data security and privacy and all that. Facebook uses the BSD license for React plus patents, not Apache. Their version was not this. So if you ever do read about what happened with React, it was a big fiasco because what Facebook said was, we're also going to give, we release React and under this BSD license, but we know you care about patents, so you can also have a patent license. But in something that resembled this poison pill, but wasn't, and was way, way worse. They said, if you ever come back and sue us, Facebook, for anything, your license expires. Not for patent infringement on this library, not because you turned around and tried to troll the thing that I just licensed to you. In fact, it went so far as, if we infringed on something else of yours and you sue us for that legitimately, your license to React goes away. Okay. That's not Apache. That's evil. Okay? And that Apache is not evil. Apache is my favorite license for corporate stuff because it has a lot of those great things that MIT and BSD have and gives us extra protection to make sure you're not going to get burned by something because someone down the road decides to patent something and go around suing people. And that brings us to the GPL. Freedom. Okay. Yeah, free isn't freedom. That's true. The GPL is a copyleft license of varying degrees of strength because there are varying versions of GPL, which we'll talk about in a second. But the GPL is a copyleft license. So to refresh, what that means is that software that is released and distributed under a GPL license not only says you have all of these things that you can do as an open source developer, but some people, and I don't really necessarily like the term, but some people refer to GPL as being like a viral license. Because once a thing is GPL and it goes and it touches something else, that thing's GPL. And then it goes and that thing touches something else, and that thing's GPL. Right? So it's not just that you have open source rights, but it's that anything that is built using GPL software is then not only that library, but the derivative work that you create with it is also going to be free and open forever and ever. Amen. That's a big problem in the business world. That is great if what you want to do is build open source software that you want to build for the community, and it's not your primary source of revenue, and you're not trying to run a multi-billion-dollar corporation around it, and it's just like a project that you care about. That's great. If what you care about is sucking in open source software into your libraries and your professional proprietary, not commercial, but your proprietary software, you've got a big problem. Because you can't. You can't. Now, really what that means, right? Free isn't freedom. What that really means is that it is the most open. It's the most open. So depending on your goals, that's great. But it really means that it's the most open because it's the most restrictive. Of all the open source libraries out there, it's the most restrictive license you're going to come across. Now, unlike Apache, so I said like you do see BSD 2 clause and 3 clause. You don't see the old Apache anymore at all. There are a lot of versions of GPL, and you see like all of them, like all the time. Even things that have been versioned, so like version 2 and version 3, you still see GPL version 2 repos in GitHub, like, and not rare, right? It's not rare. You see them a fair bit. The main differences between version 2 and version 3 are that GPL v3, which is like the current GPL, added some things around compatibility, with other licenses. It added the patent stuff. That stuff that's in Apache isn't in GPL v2. You don't get the patent license, and you don't have the poison pill in GPL v2. You do have it in v3. The other thing is, now I'm going to go way back to earlier. Remember the question about what is distribution? And it's like, well, think about things that are up in the cloud, and if it's executing in your cloud, whatever, Azure, AWS thing, and other people are just accessing that API while you haven't distributed software, that was always kind of an open question. GPL version 3 explicitly says, like, if what you have are APIs executing in a remote environment that is controlled by you, and people access that API, you have not distributed software. It makes it explicit. Version 2 does not do that. Now, LGPL, the lesser general public license, is actually what's often termed a soft copyleft. It still is a copyleft. It still has all those things about open forever, GPL forever, except it might be a little more tasteful. That's not really a fair word. It might be a little more palatable for business use and consumers, because it says that if you take this thing, and it's a library, and all you do is you dynamically link to it, right? Like add new reference, what have you. You don't commingle, right? There's no static linking. All you do is you have a dynamic reference to some external library that is LGPL. That other thing you've built that is a derivative work that links to the LGPL library is safe. It hasn't been infected. You can still have that be proprietary software and not be released under LGPL. Now, any modifications you make to the LGPL library itself will always have to be redistributed under LGPL. Okay? And the AGPL goes the opposite direction of the GPL v3. The AGPL is like the Affero. I actually have no idea. I don't know if that's a person's name. One day I'm going to look that up. The Affero GPL closes the loophole that the GPL v3 allowed, which is to say that if you are executing a remote API in some remote location somewhere up in the cloud, don't care. If people are accessing it, you're distributing software. So if something is an API that is under AGPL, letting people access it or use it in any way does make it distributed open source and must stay under GPL, which means that when people access that API and then they come to you and say, we'd like to see your source code, you have to give it to them. Okay. One other issue with GPL, GPL is fun. There's like all sorts of considerations with GPL, is compatibility. Compatibility asks this question. Can code licensed or under license whatever be combined and redistributed with code covered by GPL? Here's what that means. I'm building AcmeSoft. I want to include GPL library number 1 to help build, to use in building AcmeSoft. I also want to use open source or any software really that came from over here that is licensed under license X. Does license X do anything that would add to additional restrictions or additional obligations of the consumer, or in any way conflict with the terms of GPL? If so, they're not compatible. If not compatible, you cannot have them in the same project, full stop. The very act of trying to combine GPL library number 1 and whatever library over here into the same software by itself violates the terms of the GPL. And you can't do it. And the reason you can't do it is because, remember, the end result is GPL. And so if this other thing has other obligations or restrictions that change what would be normally the terms of GPL in the end derived work that you put out, you have a problem, because you can't do that, because you have to redistribute under GPL. So you just can't. Now, it's not a huge problem all the time, but there are scenarios where this doesn't work. Take Apache. If you have GPL v2, remember, the patent stuff wasn't there. So if I'm already using a GPL v2 library and I want to suck in something that has an Apache license, well, the Apache license adds patent licensing and protection. Well, that's adding new rights. Good. It also has the poison pill that potentially takes away your rights. Bad. So because we've added that new thing that you cannot do, they're not combinable, straight up. The old BSD, which is the 4-clause BSD with that advertising thing, none of the GPLs require that. So you cannot mix the 4-clause BSD with any version of GPL. They're not compatible at all. Okay? But to be clear, let's say they are. Let's say license X is MIT, and license Y is Apache, and GPL is GPL v3. Okay, those 3 licenses are all compatible. Or I should really say MIT and Apache 2 are compatible with GPL v3. That's fine. So I can use them all. It doesn't change the fact that it's still copyleft. So I can combine them. It does not mean that I can then turn around and redistribute my derived work as a proprietary closed source piece of software or even under MIT. No, it's going to go out under GPL v3. Still required. OK, we have 10 minutes. I heard clapping. We got 10 minutes. Great. So questions about any of the licenses at all? Cool. All right, so all that being said, the last section of the talk, I just want to talk about some sort of key considerations. And a lot of this is considerations, I keep referencing the enterprise developer, the big corporate shop. Obviously, there are plenty of environments and reasons why you would be either producing or consuming open source software. But most of us have jobs, and very many of us have jobs where we are building either proprietary commercial software, where either we are running a company or we're being paid by a company that has to worry about these things, like the GPL stuff. So what are the key considerations we have to think about when we use open source? Because we're going to, right? So a few things. First off, contributions. So I'm using some open source library and I add a new feature or I fix a bug or I do something and I want to submit a pull request and try to give back. That's great. Like, do that. In fact, I consult with companies to help them do just that, right? To say, right, like, you want to have an open source policy because you actually want to be giving back as a corporate good citizen and steward of the industry, so you want to contribute back to the open source community. That's great. But you got to think how those contributions are going to work. Or you want to open source your own stuff and think about, are you going to accept contributions? Has anyone ever heard of a CLA? Anyone ever signed one? Only a couple people. OK. So a CLA, many large repositories, if you ever decide to fork it and then want to submit a pull request, will require you to sign one. A CLA is a contributor license agreement. For people who have, a couple of you have signed CLAs before, be aware that sometimes you'll see a CAA. That's a contributor assignment agreement. They're not the same. Like, they're really not the same. They're very similar. The idea is still, like, here are the rules and what you have to do if you want to be a contributor to this project. But a license is a license, meaning if I create a contribution and I've signed a CLA, and now I submit my contribution back into the parent repository, I'm giving a license over my contribution back to the repository, right? Back to the original owner, copyright owner, the original author of the software. You have a license to the stuff that I wrote that I'm affirmatively and explicitly giving back to you, community, so you have access. A contributor assignment agreement is like the same thing, except in lawyer words, assignment means transfer. So I'm not licensing my contribution to you, I'm giving it to you. It's not revocable. I'm not retaining any rights. I've created a contribution, and I'm assigning that contribution back to the parent project. And it is no longer mine. It's no longer my intellectual property at all. They are different. Be aware of which one you're signing. Surprise. OK, surprise liability. It's like the only slide I have in any of my decks that doesn't have a transition, and that way, like, it surprises me every time. Surprise liability is something that lawyers are very frequently concerned with. OK, we're going to use this open source software, and we're going to and is someone going to come back and, like, sue us because we use this thing and there's something wrong with it? What's the answer to that, generally speaking? No. And why? Remember, in all caps, right? Most of these things are as is. So the good news is, if you are the one who is distributing software that includes open source, you probably are, lawsuits are lawsuits, but you shouldn't generally be liable for anything that goes wrong with that open source thing that you've decided to use that someone else wrote. Because when you redistributed it, I know, I see this look, I know they have a disclaimer of liability, but now when you've redistributed it, you do as well, right? On the other hand, right, if something goes wrong, the person who licensed that open source to you said, I'm not promising you that it does what you or I think it does. So it goes, it cuts both ways. The GPL risk we've talked about ad nauseum, right? But the GPL risk, you need to be concerned about it. Really, tie back the stuff about copyleft and think in your head about, OK, I understand what copyleft means now. I understand why the GPL is risky. What am I doing with this software that I'm writing? If I'm sure, and and I mean sure, that I'm not distributing anything. If I'm building software with GPL, it's going to be an internal tool, internal thing that is never being given out to the world that I'm not going to distribute. And so what if it's copyleft? The copyleft thing only applies when I distribute software. When I actually distribute the software, now that thing has to be distributed under GPL. Now when that consumer of my thing comes back and says, where's the source code, I have to say, oh, here. But if I'm not, right? So think about the risk and the trade-offs and whether it actually matters to you. What happens if there's no license? Like, what if you don't know what the license is? Like, what if you go to GitHub and there's a repo and there's no license associated with it? Then what? Yeah.
You don't have a license.
You don't have a license. It doesn't mean you can do whatever you want. You don't have a license. Right? You can start a GitHub repo and not add a licensed text file. When you don't, it doesn't matter that someone comes and finds it on the internet, did a Google search, and found a Stack Overflow answer that then cited a reference to your GitHub repo, and you have no license. They have no license. Same goes for you. Just because you found it on the internet doesn't mean you can have it. Okay? And we all do it. So we smile. Like I see you smiling, chuckling, but we all do it. Just because you found it on the internet doesn't mean you get to have it. Do you know who's backing this thing? Do you know who supports it? Do you have any idea where this license is coming from or who's writing it? Is it ASP.NET Core that's backed by all the power and resources of Microsoft? Or is it, he's here and also not in this room, but is it AutoMapper, which is basically written by Jimmy Bogard? He's pretty awesome. Hi, Jimmy. No, but, it's one person who's supporting it, who's patching it, who's making sure there's not security problems, or if there are, who's fixing it. Right? Do you actually know who's backing the thing that you're using? Might be worth knowing that. Moreover, what if Jimmy gets hit by a car? Right? Right? What happens if he's got a job to do, and at some point says, I've been doing this for 10 years, and I just don't have time to support it anymore. Like, it's out there, but I don't have time to support it. Then what? Now, the good news, especially in the .NET world, which, who here is a .NET developer? I think not that many people. OK. So like in the .NET world, for example, there's the .NET Foundation, which handles a lot of these kinds of things, because one of the things they do is they bring in, you get .NET Foundation members, and these libraries, these repos become part of that. And one of the things they do is help to have succession planning and things like that to protect against that problem. But not all libraries and not all ecosystems have that sort of a thing. So, is your company ready to take up the reins if the repository otherwise is going to die? Are you prepared to make sure that you or someone is ready to shepherd it? And then you have to think about your long-term strategy. And what I mean there is not just how you're using the software today, but how are you going to use it tomorrow? Because what's OK now may not be OK if 3 years from now someone wants to acquire me. And they want to see an audit of everything that's ever been in my software. And something I thought wouldn't matter when I wrote it 3 years ago matters today. And I lose my sale. Or I have to rewrite all my software. So try to plan out and understand the long-term goals. Now, all that being said, I don't want to scare people, right? Because we save time and money when we use open source software, and it is impossible to, from a practical standpoint, to reasonably write software today without having open source. That's OK. You just have to have a plan. Right? You got to think about what you're going to do. Now, there are I'm not affiliated with these companies. The one thing you can do is there's Black Duck, there's White Source, who's actually, I think, a sponsor here. And there are others who have software products that help you keep track of these things. What's in my software? What do I have? That's really hard in the JavaScript world. With people use NPM, right? It's awfully hard to know what your dependency tree looks like. What's in my software? So there are tools for that. The problem is those tools, in a giant enterprise scenario, may be OK and may be great. They can be a bit of fearmongers, right? Just kind of scare you all the time about everything could be wrong. And they cost a lot of money, because what they do is valuable. But if you got to know your needs, your organization, your client, your whatever. Sometimes it just comes down to teamwork. The most important thing you can do is have teamwork. Okay? What I do with most repos is I start off and I say I need a thumbs up and a thumbs down. Like at the very beginning, get a team together and say, we're going to use open source. So here's the deal. You guys haven't thought about this before. That's great. But we're going to say, if you see software and you need to check the box, at least look at what the license is. And if it's this one or this one or this one, OK, great. If you see this one or this one, do not use it, please. If it's something else and you're not sure and you think it's important, let's talk about it and we'll figure it out. Because otherwise what happens is developers don't like lawyers. Developers don't want to go to legal. They don't even want to go to their boss or their tech lead and say, is this OK? So they're just going to say, it's open source. It's fine. So provide a framework and include everyone in the discussion. Because then maybe if that's not OK, at least they'll look at the second hit in Google and see if that one is OK before just doing something that could jeopardize your entire product or your entire project. Right? The bottom line is you put the right tools in place and you involve everyone in the discussion and everyone's to get on board and work together. Okay. So what I just want you to take from this, and I think we're out of time in 2 minutes. All right, great. So like, I don't want you all to go become IP lawyers. Please don't do that. Because I don't even like myself for being a lawyer. Don't go become an attorney. But think about this. Understand why it matters. And have a plan. So that you don't run afoul of something and end up shooting yourself in the foot when it really, really matters. Include your team. Get everyone on board. If you run a team today, and you're responsible for these decisions, it's not enough for you to sit here and say, I've made these decisions. Educate the other people in your organization. Educate the people that, not just your reports, educate up too. Educate the people who are the leaders in your organization so they understand why this matters. Right? Get everyone involved. When you do that, you empower people. When you empower people, people are willing to actually take ownership of a problem. People are willing to actually understand the risks and the benefits. And you're more likely to have a good result in the end. That's all I have. If you want to, if you have questions, this is my only talk here, and I'm here all the way until Saturday morning. I will be around. If you have questions, find me, ask me, find me on Twitter anytime, and I'm happy to answer any questions. That's it.